The maid was caught. Elias had his hand on the truth, but Zuri didn't blink. He thought he was protecting a mafia king. He didn't realize he was facing a goddess of industry who could buy and sell his master by sunrise. Stay with me, because the secret they share in the dark is about to burn the Sterling mansion to the ground. The air in the cramped staff quarters felt like it was ionizing. Elias, a man whose very presence was a death sentence to most, stood rooted to the floor. He stared at Zuri. No, he stared through her. The woman standing before him wasn't the girl who had spent the last 90 days scrubbing the grime of the Sterling family from the baseboards. This woman had a spine of cold-rolled steel and eyes that had seen the inside of 100 boardrooms. "You're Zuri Bennett," Elias whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "The Yale prodigy, the ghost CEO of Bennett Global." Zuri didn't lower her phone. "And you're a man who prides himself on knowing every threat before it enters the room. You're 6 weeks late, Elias." Elias stepped further into the room, the floorboards groaning under his weight. Why would a woman worth nearly $4 billion put on a polyester uniform and handle bleach? Because $200 million is a lot of money to give to a man who might be laundering it for the syndicate, Zuri replied, her voice a low, dangerous hum. "I don't trust spreadsheets, Elias. I trust what I see when people think no one is watching. I wanted to see if Julian Sterling was a partner or a target." Elias leaned against the doorframe, his hand twitching near his holster, not out of aggression, but out of a deep, unsettling nerves. "And what did you find?" "I found that Julian is trying to buy his way into the light," Zuri said, packing the small room like a caged panther. "His hotels are clean, his books are tighter than a drum, but I also found that his wife is a liability. Isabella treats this house like a playground for her cruelty. In my world, Elias, a man is only as strong as his weakest link. Isabella isn't just a link, she's a ticking bomb." "She's a nightmare," Elias admitted, his voice dropping an octave. "She treats the staff like cattle. I've watched her humiliate girls for sport for 3 years, but Julian stays out of it." "Not anymore," Zuri snapped. "She invited me to the gala as a joke. She wants to parade the black maid in front of her high society friends to show them how charitable she is. She wants to laugh while I struggle to find the right fork." Elias let out a short, dark laugh. "She has no idea she just invited a hurricane to her garden party." "No," Zuri said, her eyes flashing with a predatory light. "She doesn't, and you're going to help me make sure she never sees it coming." The next morning, the mansion was a hive of activity. Crate after crate of expensive champagne and exotic flowers were being hauled through the service entrance. Isabella was in her element, barking orders at the catering staff, her voice echoing through the grand hall like a whip. Zuri was back in her role, polishing the massive silver candelabras in the dining room. Every muscle in her body ached from the performance, but the end was in sight. Suddenly, the heavy double doors at the end of the hall swung open. Julian Sterling entered. He wasn't like the flashy mobsters in the movies. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, and his face was a mask of weary intelligence. He stopped when he saw Zuri. "You," he said, gesturing for her to follow him into his private study. Inside, the room smelled of old paper and expensive tobacco. Julian sat behind his mahogany desk and studied her for a long, agonizing minute. "My wife tells me you're attending the gala," Julian began, his voice surprisingly gentle. "She was very insistent, sir," Zuri replied, keeping her eyes cast downward, the perfect image of a submissive servant. Julian sighed, a sound of genuine exhaustion. "Isabella has a difficult personality. She thinks she's being clever, but she's being cruel. You don't have to go, Zuri. I can make an excuse for you. You shouldn't have to be the butt of her jokes." Zuri slowly raised her head. For the first time, she let the mask slip just a fraction. She didn't look like a maid. She looked like an equal. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice steady and clear. "But I think it's important that I'm there. Some things need to be seen in the light for people to understand their true value." Julian froze. He leaned forward, his sharp eyes narrowing as he scanned her face, her hands, her posture. He was a man who lived and died by his instincts, and right now, every alarm bell in his head was screaming. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "No maid speaks like that. No maid has hands that have never known a day of hard labor until 3 months ago." Zuri smiled, a cold, brilliant smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm the person you've been trying to get a meeting with for half a year, Julian, and I'm the person who is currently deciding if I should save your company or bury it." The silence that followed was deafening. Julian didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't call for security. Instead, he slowly began to laugh. It was a dry, appreciative sound. "Zuri Bennett," he breathed, shaking his head. "You've been under my roof for 3 months, eating in my kitchen, cleaning my floors, just to see if I was worth the ink on a contract." "Due diligence is a lost art," Zuri said, standing tall. Julian stood up and walked toward the window, looking out at the gardens where his wife was currently berating a florist. "She's going to try to destroy you tonight, you know. She has a whole performance planned." "Let her try," Zuri said. Julian turned back to her, a spark of something like admiration or maybe even love in his eyes. "Do me a favor, Zuri." "What's that?" "When you reveal who you are, don't hold back. Destroy her. She needs to learn that the world doesn't belong to people like her." Zuri nodded once. "Consider it done." As she left the study, she bumped into Mrs. Park. The older woman looked at Zuri, then at the closed door of the study, and then back at Zuri. She grabbed Zuri's arm and pulled her into the laundry room. "I don't know who you are, child," Mrs. Park whispered, "but the security guy Elias is outside making calls about a package delivery from Milan, and he's smiling. He never smiles." Zuri squeezed the older woman's hand. "Everything is going to change tonight, Mrs. Park. Just make sure you're watching the front doors at 9:00 p.m. "I'll be there," Mrs. Park said, a mischievous glint in her eye. "I wouldn't miss this for all the champagne in France." The stage was set. The invitations were out. The wolf was in the fold, and the sheep was sharpening her teeth. Isabella Sterling thought she was the queen of the night, but she was about to find out that in Zuri Bennett's world, queens are just pieces on a board, and the game was already over. The clock is ticking toward Isabella's moment of triumph, or so she thinks. While she paints her face with arrogance, Zuri is shedding the skin of a servant. A $2 million transformation is happening in the shadows. Pause, don't look away, because the woman who walked in through the back door is about to burn the front entrance down. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long skeletal shadows across the Sterling estate. Inside, the atmosphere was electric with the kind of frantic energy that preceded high society executions. Isabella Sterling stood in her dressing room, surrounded by a small army of stylists. She looked at her reflection, a vision in gold lace and blood-red lipstick, and smiled. It was the smile of a predator that had already cornered its prey. "Is the maid ready?" Isabella asked, her voice dripping with mock concern as she adjusted a diamond earring. "She's in the staff wing, ma'am," her lead stylist replied. "The other servants say she's been quiet all day." "Good," Isabella purred. "I want her quiet. I want her terrified. When I call her to the stage tonight to receive her charity, I want the world to see the dirt she came from." But 2 floors down, in the dim light of the laundry room, a different kind of preparation was underway. Elias, the head of security, stood by the service elevator. He checked his watch. 8:00 p.m. On the dot, the heavy steel doors slid open. Two men in unmarked black suits stepped out, carrying a long, hardshell garment bag and a reinforced steel briefcase. They didn't look like delivery men. They looked like soldiers. "For Ms. Bennett," the taller one said, his voice clipped and professional. Elias nodded and gestured toward the back hallway that led to Zuri's small quarters. "Take it in. The perimeter is secure. No one enters that wing until she's ready." Inside her room, Zuri stood in the center of the floor. The polyester Maid uniform lay in a heap in the corner, a discarded skin. She reached out and unzipped the garment bag. The midnight blue fabric of the custom Versace gown seemed to swallow the dim light of the room, shimmering with a deep, cosmic luster that no camera could truly capture. She stepped into the dress. The silk felt like cool water against her skin, a stark contrast to the rough cotton she had worn for 90 days. As she pulled the zipper up, she felt the weight of her true identity returning. She wasn't Zuri the maid. She was Zuri Bennett, the woman who dictated the flow of billions. Next came the briefcase. When the lid snapped open, the room was suddenly filled with a blinding brilliance. The Cartier Heritage Collection, a necklace of pear-shaped diamonds so rare they had their own names, paired with earrings that sparkled like captured stars. Total value, $2.3 million. Zuri fastened the diamonds around her neck. They felt heavy, they felt like power. A soft knock at the door. It was Mrs. Park. The older woman stepped inside and stopped, her breath catching in her throat. She looked at the woman standing before her, a regal, devastating figure of elegance and authority, and then looked at the pile of cleaning rags on the floor. "Oh, my dear child," Mrs. Park whispered, her eyes filling with tears of pure joy. "I knew you were special, but this, you look like a queen coming to reclaim her throne." "Tonight, Mrs. Park, I'm just a mirror," Zuri said, her voice dropping into that low CEO resonance. "I'm going to show Isabella exactly who she is." "She's already starting the show upstairs," Mrs. Park warned. "She's telling everyone how she rescued you from the streets. She's making a mockery of your hard work." Zuri picked up a small, encrypted earpiece and fitted it into her ear. "Marcus, are you in position?" "The motorcade is 2 minutes out from the front gates, boss," Marcus's voice crackled in her ear. "The press is already buzzing. They heard a mystery guest is arriving. They have no idea it's you." "Good," Zuri said. She turned to Elias, who was now standing in the doorway, his arms crossed. He looked at her, and for the first time in his career, he dipped his head in a genuine bow. "The car is waiting at the side exit," Elias said. "I've looped the security cameras in the ballroom. Isabella won't see you coming until you're 10 feet away from her." "Wait for the signal, Elias," Zuri commanded. "I want her to reach the peak of her speech. I want her to feel untouchable. That's when we strike." As Zuri walked down the narrow service corridor, her heels clicking with a lethal rhythm, she passed the industrial kitchen. The staff stopped what they were doing. The chefs, the dishwashers, the servers, the people Isabella ignored every day all stood in stunned silence. They recognized the face, but the aura was different. This was the woman who had helped them with their heavy lifting, who had listened to their stories of struggle, now dressed in more wealth than they would see in 10 lifetimes. Zuri didn't say a word. She just gave them a sharp, knowing nod. "This is for all of us," her eyes said. Outside, a blacked-out Rolls-Royce Ghost sat idling in the shadows. Marcus stepped out and opened the door. "Your chariot, Ms. Bennett." "Drive around the block," Zuri said, as she settled into the leather seat. "I want to arrive exactly 15 minutes after the gala begins. Let the tension build. Let Isabella wonder why her entertainment hasn't shown up to be humiliated." The car pulled away, tires whispering against the gravel. Back inside the mansion, the ballroom was filling with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume. Isabella was center stage, holding a glass of champagne, laughing with a senator's wife. "Where is that girl?" Isabella whispered to her friend, checking her diamond-encrusted watch. "If she thinks she can skip out on my charity, she's in for a very rude awakening tomorrow morning." Little did she know, the awakening was already at the front gate, and it wasn't going to be rude, it was going to be total. The room was full of the elite, all waiting for a punchline that never came. Isabella checked her watch, ready to mock the girl she thought she owned. Pause, then the doors groaned open. The silence that followed wasn't just shock, it was the sound of an empire beginning to crumble. "Stay with me, because the queen is about to realize she's just a pawn." The Riverside Hotel ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk and forced smiles. Isabella Sterling moved through the crowd like a shark in shallow water, her eyes constantly darting toward the service entrance. It was 9:30 p.m. Her guest of honor, the little maid she intended to use as a prop for her own ego, was nowhere to be found. "She's probably terrified, hiding in some alley in that cheap polyester," Isabella whispered to her circle of friends, her laughter cutting through the soft, orchestral music. The poor thing likely realized that no amount of soap can wash off the scent of the working class. Her friends giggled, their designer handbags clutched tight, enjoying the cruel entertainment. Julian Sterling stood near the bar, nursing a scotch. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on the grand main entrance, the one reserved for the most important guests in the state. He knew what was coming. He had seen the fire in Zuri's eyes in his study. He knew that tonight, the Sterling name would either be redeemed or incinerated. Suddenly, the music didn't just fade, it died. The massive mahogany doors at the front of the ballroom were thrown open with a force that made the crystal chandeliers rattle. Every conversation in the room snapped shut. Every head turned. Zuri Bennett stood in the doorway, and she was devastating. The custom Versace gown she wore was a shade of midnight blue so deep it seemed to pull the light from the room. It wasn't just a dress, it was a statement of war. The fabric moved like liquid silk, catching the light with every breath she took. But it was the necklace that stopped hearts. The Cartier diamonds at her throat were worth more than the combined net worth of half the people in the room, over $2.3 million of raw, glittering power. She didn't look like a maid playing dress-up. She looked like royalty who had grown tired of the commoners' games. Isabella's champagne glass slipped from her numb fingers, shattering against the marble floor with a sound that echoed like a gunshot. The liquid splattered against her gold lace gown, but she didn't even blink. Her face went from a triumphant flush to a ghostly, sickly white. That's her," Isabella stammered, her voice shaking so hard it was barely audible. Where did she get that? That's my maid." Zuri didn't wait for an introduction. She began to walk. Her pace was slow, deliberate, and predatory. Every eye in the room followed her as she moved directly toward the center of the ballroom, toward the woman who had spent 3 months trying to break her spirit. Dave, the head of security, was positioned by the pillar. He wasn't watching the crowd. He was watching Isabella's face, his phone held discreetly at chest level, recording every second of the social execution. Beside him, Mrs. Park stood with a tray of empty glasses, her chest swelling with pride, a single tear of joy tracing a line through her wrinkles. Zuri stopped exactly 3 feet from Isabella. The silence was so heavy it felt like it might collapse. "Thank you for the invitation, Isabella," Zuri said, her voice carrying across the ballroom with the effortless authority of a woman who owned the world. "It was so thoughtful of you to include me. I know you were worried I wouldn't find something suitable to wear." She reached up, delicately touching one of the pear-shaped diamonds at her throat. "I hope this qualifies." A ripple of shocked whispers erupted. "Is that the Cartier heritage?" one socialite breathed. I saw that at auction. It went for millions. Isabella finally found her voice, though it was shrill and desperate. You're a thief. You stole that. You're a maid. Security. Elias, get this woman out of here. Elias stepped forward, but he didn't move toward Zuri. He moved toward Isabella. He stood between the two women, but his back was turned to Zuri. He was protecting her. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding, Mrs. Sterling, Elias said, his voice cold as ice. There is no misunderstanding, Isabella screamed, her composure disintegrating. She scrubs my floors. She's a nobody. Julian Sterling stepped out of the shadows, walking calmly into the circle. He looked at his wife with a mixture of pity and disgust, then turned to Zuri and gave a slight, respectful nod. Isabella, Julian said, his voice quiet but commanding, I'd like you to meet the guest of honor you've been waiting for. This is Zuri Bennett, CEO of Bennett Global Industries. The ballroom didn't just erupt, it felt like it exploded. The name Bennett Global was synonymous with untouchable power. The realization hit the crowd like a tidal wave. The woman they had been prepared to laugh at was the woman who likely owned the buildings they lived in. Zuri smiled, a sharp, lethal curve of the lips. Actually, Isabella, I wasn't just your maid, I was your auditor. The secret is out, and the air in the ballroom has turned to ice. Isabella's joke has become her own public execution. Zuri didn't just come for the champagne, she came for the truth. Stay with me, because the files she's about to open will change the Sterling legacy forever. The name Zuri Bennett rippled through the ballroom like a physical shock. The women who had laughed in the doorway of the mansion only days ago were now retreating into the shadows, their designer handbags suddenly feeling like weights they couldn't carry. Isabella Sterling stood frozen, the shattered glass at her feet a perfect metaphor for her social standing. An auditor, Isabella whispered, her voice cracking as she looked at Julian. You let her into our home, you let a billionaire scrub our toilets. Zuri stepped forward, the $2 million Cartier diamonds catching the light and blinding the front row of onlookers. I didn't let anyone do anything, Isabella. I applied for a job, and you were too blinded by your own arrogance to see anything past the headscarf and the bucket, Zuri said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. She turned her gaze to the entire room, her presence commanding every eye. 3 months ago, Sterling Luxury Groups approached Bennett Global for a $200 million partnership. Most CEOs would have sent a team of junior analysts to look at the books. I don't do things the easy way. I wanted to see if the people behind the numbers were worth my time. Zuri paced slowly in a circle, the midnight blue Versace gown trailing behind her like a royal cape. I spent 90 days cleaning your filth, Isabella. I heard the way you spoke to the catering staff. I saw the way you treated Mrs. Park and Alina, women who have more dignity in their smallest finger than you have in your entire bloodline. A gasp went through the crowd as Zuri looked directly at Julian. I found what I was looking for. Your husband is trying to build something legitimate. His hotels are clean. His staff is paid above market rate. He remembers their names. Then she turned back to Isabella, her eyes turning into flint. But you are the liability. You treat people like furniture. You used a charity gala, a night meant for the less fortunate, as a stage for your own petty cruelty. You didn't invite a maid here tonight to be kind. You invited me here to be a punchline. Isabella's face was a mask of fury and humiliation. You've embarrassed me in front of my peers. You lied. This is infiltration. No, Zuri countered sharply. This is due diligence, and the results are in. I've already authorized the $200 million investment into Julian's hotel group. A murmur of relief and surprise broke out among the business associates in the room. Zuri's voice dropped to a low, lethal whisper that somehow reached every corner of the silent hall. But I made one condition on that contract, Isabella. One piece of house cleaning that needs to be done before a single cent of Bennett money touches the sterling accounts. Isabella blinked, her eyes darting to Julian. What condition? Julian stepped forward, his expression hard, his eyes finally meeting his wife's with a coldness she had never seen before. The condition, Isabella, is that you no longer represent this family or this company. The room went so quiet you could hear the clock on the far wall ticking. Zuri stood tall, her mission complete. She had seen the truth, she had rewarded the worthy, and she had dismantled the cruel. The joke was never on me, Isabella, Zuri said, turning her back on the woman. It was always on you. The crowd is frozen, watching the predator become the prey. Isabella's world didn't just crack, it shattered. But the real danger isn't the public shame. It's the choice Julian Sterling has to make between his bloodline and his future. Stay with me, because the night is young, and the true cost of this betrayal is about to be tallied. Isabella Sterling looked like a ghost haunting her own party. She reached out to grab Julian's arm, her fingers trembling against his charcoal suit jacket. Julian, you can't be serious. You're siding with a servant. You're going to throw away our reputation for a woman who lied to us for months. Julian didn't flinch. He looked down at her hand as if it were a stain he had finally decided to wash away. She didn't lie about who she was, Isabella. She just didn't correct your assumptions. You saw a uniform and decided she was nothing. I saw a woman who worked harder than anyone in this room, and I wondered why. He turned back to Zuri, his voice steadying. The papers are already drafted, Isabella. My lawyers have been monitoring the charity accounts you've been using for your personal shopping trips. You didn't just humiliate our staff. You embezzled from the very people this gala was supposed to help. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. The socialites who had been Isabella's closest friends suddenly stepped back, creating a literal circle of isolation around her. In high society, cruelty is often overlooked, but stealing from charity is a death sentence. Zuri stepped closer, the $2 million diamonds at her throat reflecting the cold light of the room. You wanted to show me how the other half lives, Isabella? Well, this is it. The other half lives with integrity. They live with the knowledge that their worth isn't tied to a label or a husband's bank account. You have neither. Isabella's eyes darted around the room, looking for an ally, but she found only stone-cold faces. She looked at Elias, the man she had ordered around for years. Elias, escort this woman out, now. Elias didn't move an inch. He stood behind Zuri like a guardian of old. I take my orders from the head of the family, ma'am, Elias said, his voice a low, satisfied rumble. And right now, that doesn't seem to be you. The humiliation was complete. Isabella, once the undisputed queen of the city's elite, turned and fled the ballroom. The sound of her heels clicking frantically against the marble was the only music left in the room. No one followed her. No one called her name. Julian let out a long, weary breath. He turned to the crowd, his voice regaining its authority. The gala will continue, but the proceeds tonight will not be going to the Sterling Foundation. They will be donated directly to the Bennett Global Initiative for Workers' Rights. Please enjoy the evening. As the orchestra began to play a slow, somber melody, the tension in the room began to bleed out, replaced by a frantic buzz of gossip. Julian turned to Zuri, gesturing toward the balcony where the cool night air was beckoning. I suppose I owe you more than just a partnership, Ms. Bennett, Julian said as they stepped out into the dark. The city lights of Seattle sparkled below them like a carpet of fallen stars. Zuri leaned against the stone railing, the midnight blue Versace catching the moonlight. You owe me nothing, Julian. You passed the test. You chose the truth over the lie, even when the lie was wearing a wedding ring. Julian stood beside her, the silhouette of a man who had just lost a wife but found his soul. I knew something was different about you the day you started. You didn't scrub floors like someone who needed the money. You scrubbed them like someone who was looking for the cracks in the foundation. And I found them, Zuri said, looking at him. But I also found that the foundation itself, the man running the show, was still solid. That's why I'm staying. Julian frowned. Staying? You've revealed yourself. The mystery is over. Zuri smiled, a warm, genuine expression that reached her eyes for the first time in months. The mystery of the maid is over, yes, but the partnership is just beginning, and I think we have a lot of cleaning up to do in this city. Suddenly the earpiece in Zuri's ear crackled. It was Marcus. Boss, we have a problem. Isabella didn't go home. She headed straight for the docks. She's meeting with the syndicate's old guard. She's not going down without a fight. Zuri's face went cold. The drama wasn't over. It was just moving from the ballroom to the streets. Julian, Zuri said, her voice dropping into that lethal CEO tone. I hope you're ready, because your wife just declared war on both of us. The gala was just the beginning. Isabella Sterling didn't go home to pack. She went to the docks to burn the world down. She's trading her husband's secrets for a chance at Zuri's life. Stay until the end, because the fog is rolling in, and not everyone is coming back from the harbor tonight. The Seattle waterfront was a graveyard of rusted shipping containers and broken dreams. A thick gray fog rolled off the Pacific, swallowing the light of the moon. Isabella Sterling stood by Pier 47, her gold-laced dress now torn and stained, her eyes wide with a manic, desperate light. Across from her stood a man known only as the Vulture. He was the last of the old guard, a remnant of the syndicate that Julian Sterling had spent years trying to erase. I have the offshore keys, Isabella hissed, clutching a small USB drive as if it were a holy relic. Everything Julian hid, the real accounts, the names of the silent partners, I'll give it all to you if you kill her. I want Zuri Bennett erased. The Vulture smiled, showing teeth that had seen too much darkness. Zuri Bennett is a big name, Isabella. Killing a billionaire brings a lot of heat, but for the Sterling keys, I'll make her disappear into the deep water. Suddenly, the roar of a high-performance engine shattered the silence. A black SUV skidded around the corner, its headlights cutting through the fog like twin blades. The doors flew open before the vehicle even came to a complete stop. Zuri Bennett stepped out. She had discarded the Versace gown for a sleek, tactical black bodysuit, but she still wore the $2 million Cartier diamonds around her neck, a deliberate insult, a reminder of the wealth Isabella could never touch again. Beside her stood Julian, his face a mask of cold fury, and Elias, whose hand was already on his sidearm. The game is over, Isabella, Zuri's voice rang out, echoing off the metal containers. The keys you're holding, I changed the encryption 10 minutes ago from my phone. They're worthless pieces of plastic. Isabella looked down at the USB drive in horror. No, you couldn't have. I own the servers, those accounts live on, Zuri said, stepping into the circle of light. Did you really think I'd leave the doors unlocked while I was staying in your house? The Vulture looked from the useless drive to Zuri, then back to Isabella. His hand drifted toward the holster at his small of his back. It seems you've brought me a handful of nothing, Isabella, and you brought a war to my doorstep. Let her go, Vulture, Julian commanded, stepping forward. This is between the Sterlings and the Bennetts. You don't want the heat that comes with touching either of us. I don't like being lied to, the Vulture growled. He lunged for Isabella, grabbing her by the throat and pulling her in front of him as a human shield. Maybe I can't have the money, but I can have a little leverage. Julian, help me, Isabella screamed, her voice echoing over the water. Julian hesitated for a split second, the ghost of a man who once loved her flickering in his eyes. But Zuri didn't hesitate. She looked at Elias and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The bullet didn't hit the vulture. It hit the rusted chain of a massive shipping crate hanging directly above them. The metal groaned, a high-pitched scream of failing steel, before the crate shifted with a thunderous roar. The vulture panicked, dropping Isabella and diving toward the pier's edge. Elias moved like a shadow, tackling the vulture before he could hit the water, pinning him to the salt-stained wood. Julian rushed forward, but not to Isabella. He moved to block the path of the vulture's men who were emerging from the warehouse. Zuri walked calmly toward Isabella, who was sobbing on the ground, her face pressed against the cold, wet concrete. Zuri reached down and grabbed the USB drive from Isabella's trembling hand. "You tried to sell your husband's life to buy your way back into a world that already rejected you," Zuri said, her voice filled with a terrifying calm. "You didn't just lose your status tonight, Isabella. You lost your humanity." "You took everything from me," Isabella shrieked. "No," Zuri countered, leaning down so their eyes met. "I just turned the lights on. You were the one who let everyone see the roaches." Zuri turned to Elias. "Call the authorities. Tell them we have the head of the syndicate and the woman who tried to fund them. Give them the unencrypted files. I want this city clean by sunrise." As the sirens began to wail in the distance, Julian walked over to Zuri. He looked at the woman who had transformed from his maid to his savior in less than 24 hours. "It's finally over," Julian said, the weight of a decade lifting from his shoulders. "Not quite," Zuri said, looking out at the rising sun. "We still have the 8th part of the plan, the part where we build something that can't be broken by people like her." The storm has passed, and the wreckage of Isabella's ego is being hauled away in handcuffs. But for Zuri and Julian, the real story is just beginning. Stay for these final words, because what Zuri does with her $2 million dress will prove that true power isn't what you wear, but who you protect. The morning sun began to bleed over the Seattle skyline, painting the Space Needle in hues of gold and copper. On the balcony of the grand penthouse, Zuri Bennett stood looking out at the city she had just saved from a silent poison. She was still wearing the midnight blue Versace, though the $2 million diamonds now sat in a velvet case on the table behind her. The door clicked open. Julian Sterling walked out, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He had traded his tuxedo for a simple sweater, looking more like the man he was meant to be than the shadow he had been forced to play. "The police just finished their initial report," Julian said, handing her a cup. "The vulture is talking. Isabella is being processed. They found even more offshore accounts, money she was funneling away from the hotel staff's pension funds. You were right about everything, Zuri. The rot was deeper than I wanted to admit." Zuri took a sip of the coffee, the warmth spreading through her. "Power doesn't change people, Julian. It just unmasks them. Isabella didn't become a monster when she married into your family. She just finally had the platform to show it." Julian leaned against the railing next to her. For a long moment, they simply watched the city wake up. The silence wasn't heavy anymore, it was comfortable. "What happens now, to Bennett Global, to the partnership?" Zuri turned to face him, a playful spark in her eyes. "Well, the $200 million investment is already in your account, but I've decided to add a new clause. Every Sterling hotel will now have a dignity program. No staff member is invisible. Every maid, every janitor, every cook, they get a seat at the table. And Mrs. Park, she's the new director of hospitality for the entire Pacific Northwest region." Julian laughed, a genuine, light-hearted sound. "I think she'll be the toughest boss I've ever had." "She already is," Zuri smiled. She looked down at her dress, the expensive silk shimmering in the daylight. And this dress, I'm auctioning it off today. The proceeds will go toward a scholarship fund for women who want to get their MBAs but can't afford the bus fare to the interview. I want more maids sitting in CEO chairs. Julian reached out, his hand covering hers on the railing. The tension between them, which had started in a dusty foyer months ago, finally snapped into something real. You're a remarkable woman, Zuri Bennett. You didn't just save my company, you saved me. We saved each other, Julian, she whispered. As they stood there, the distance between them disappeared. In the quiet of the morning, far above the streets where she had once scrubbed floors, Zuri Bennett, the billionaire who knew the value of a soap bucket, finally found something that money couldn't buy. She found a partner who saw her when she was invisible and loved her when she was a queen. Zuri went from an undercover billionaire Maid to exposing a criminal empire and finding a love built on respect. She proved that your uniform doesn't define your worth, your character does. If this story reminded you to never look down on anyone unless you're helping them up, drop a heart in the comments right now. And if you want to see more stories of savage vindication and true justice, smash that like button and subscribe to join our elite circle. Don't let the world tell you who you are, show them.